I want you to come with me into eternity. We are here for the earth. We are here for life. We are here to be cosmically intelligent. When enough of us are cosmically intelligent, we will open the earth to cosmic life and participate in that inconceivable reality.
Okay, the excitement continues as we move forward to look at card number 4, the Emperor. Here it is in the Rider-Waite deck, very famous image of the stern-countenanced male figure whose gaze, just like the Empress in one way, meets ours. But there he is in his great marble throne with the ram's heads, color red predominantly. Certainly that is true for the Thoth deck. Although he's facing not towards us but away from us. This will become important as we proceed. Why that small difference? One looking out, one with the head turned. That would be more like more consistent with the playing cards, the famous gaming cards in which the various royal figures in that, the Queen and the King, some are facing towards us, some are facing away. But here we find that in the Thoth deck they're facing away. Let's open with a quote though. I always start with a quote here, this time from William Blake, his Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Without contraries, there is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. From these contraries springs what the religions call good and evil. Now we've been looking at oppositions from the beginning of the series. If you listen back, you'll see that the concept of oppositions, earth and sky, or masculine and feminine, are important. So this opening quote from Blake helps us to realize that in the analysis of almost every archetype, every card, you're dealing with polarities. But we also added, did we not, that we should maybe not always look at polarities as something negative. There's an interplay. Remember the yin-yang, the line of that image is where opposites come together. So it's almost one of those paradoxicons. How do you perceive it? Do you perceive it as keeping things apart, or do you see it as bringing things together? And we'll see in a minute that it's the same kind of thing with this card. But even when we looked at the High Priestess, we saw two pillars, one black, one white. We said that there's a difference between the seen processes and the seen workings, say those below the soil, and then there's the more obvious processes that the senses can discern. With the Empress, we noted that there was a terrestrial garden. She's the queen, the mother of the terrestrial grove and garden. But there's an analogy, there's an analog in the celestial mother, the great primordial mother. What could be more a symbol of these polarities than the Reti, the two mothers, the sisters of the two lands? And now when we come to this masculine archetype, we'll see that it has this as well. We've looked at a lot of the female archetypes. Now it's time to look a little bit, just a little bit, at the masculine and what we can discern from that. What did the creators of the tarot, what do the astrologers and Kabbalists have to say about masculine energy? I mean, the Priestess and the Empress were side by side, weren't they? Well, right now we've got the Emperor and the Hierophant for our next program. But there are two pretty strong masculine archetypes. One is the authority figure, the king. The other is the religious authority, representative of God, or even representing all things, all matters theological. But just as it was with the Empress, don't be fooled into thinking that this is a simple archetype. It's actually very complex. Not as straightforward as one would think. But again, if we turn to the imagery, what do we see? A stern male on a great red throne. In most decks, as we said, he's facing the viewer. In the Thoth deck, that's different, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. This is the alpha male, isn't it? This is the all-father. It used to be called in Celtic tradition the Dispater, the great father, the sort of Zeus figure. In the Gnostic tradition, well, in religious tradition, he passes for God. But in the Gnostic tradition, this would be the Rex Mundi, the Lord of the world. In Masonic circles, it's the grand architect of the universe. The artifacts to the Hermeticists. He's Allah, he's Jehovah, as I said, Zeus, the patriarch, the king, the chieftain. He would be, in the mythologies of the world, Marduk, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Ra, Odin, certainly, Arthur, King Arthur. In the biblical tradition, we might have Abraham, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and even the great Samson with his mighty strength and his kingly stature, and his supernatural strength, heroic figures, Certainly in other traditions you could see him, or even in history. We had Akhenaten, didn't we? And before that we had other great pharaohs, the Tutmosis pharaohs and what have you. We had Alexander the Great, stalking around the world and doing heroic things. We had Constantine, a king who launches what we know today to be Christianity. We have Charlemagne, all of these larger-than-life characters. But even in our own personal life, this is the father and the grandfather. Think about Native American Indian traditions or what have that kind of traditions. This is the ancestor, the great ancestor. Somebody who may have built all the things around you, right? But certainly, as I said, on a mundane level, it's the chief, it's the boss, it's the superior, it's the coach. From a psychological point of view, if one is up on the teachings of the psychologist Alfred Adler, very important psychologist, contemporary of Freud, inventor of the terms superiority and inferiority complex and their interrelationship. Alfred Adler, this would fit his superiority type. Actually, it would fit more his ruling type. He had different decompartmentalizations we don't have time to go into, but this would be the ruling type of personality. And I assume that he also meant that women could be ruling types, not just men. It's about independence. He's the independent one. As long as we realize from an Adlerian point of view that this independence and this autonomy is not necessarily to be confused with aggression and outright sadism. Some people think that the moment you mention anything masculine, that's what you're dealing with. Well, that's completely not true. From a Jungian point of view, this is the famous animus. As we said earlier, don't be fooled, this is not straightforward. There's a complex archetype, the animus. Just when we saw that the anima is man's accumulated phylogenetic memory of all things womanly and all things motherly. Well, guess what? There's that counterpoint again. There's that syzygy. Well, this card, this archetype represents all things masculine that both women and men have experienced down through history. And sure, that definitely includes some sort of kingliness and princeliness and warriorness, the Lancelot syndrome, but it also is the protector and the builder and the creator and the wayshower and all these other archetypes. And not to forget that even the animus is found in women, as the anima is found in men. In Freudianism, this would be the father imago. Now, he's not talking in terms of archetypes, he's just talking about your dad, your father, and your uncles in your physical domestic sphere personalities, the grandfather and so on. That's these guys. The father imago is your first image of the male, key to the development of what he called the superego. Not to mention another facet we don't have time to explore, the ego ideal. Very important. Every single person watching this has a superego and an ego ideal. And those are conditioned, those are patterned upon, successfully or unsuccessfully, your father. This representative of the masculine world. Superego rules our sense of right and wrong. Again, very briefly and very topically, we can just say it rules it's the basis of our conscience and morality. Whereas the ego ideal, again, part of our consciousness, part of our mind, is called the ego ideal. That's our self-image. But we develop our self-image by the heroes that we have and the ones that we generally look up to. And there's a class of people, i.e. the psychopaths, who don't look up to anyone. And that's why they're psychopaths, because something happened in their life where this wasn't there. Or the relationship with this was in some way tweaked and made negative, you see. So a great effect on the mind in the Freudian, this is huge in the Freudian model. Can't unpack the whole story of the superego and its nuances, I've done that in other work, or even the ego ideal, man's and woman's own self-image, which is based on a dynamic of who you admire as opposed to who you envy, and whether or not your admiration of those heroes is in the end justified because of that image that you've projected collapses, or if your heroes turn out to be not so wonderful. That can have severe consequences to consciousness. There's a whole lot one can get into just in the psychological mode. But this father imago in the Freudian sense is not only our sense of right and wrong, it's going to be more even practical than that. It's just the laws of behavior. How does one behave in the home? How does one get what they want? How does one behave in society? All right, the mother gives birth, so she's sort of the mistress of the domestic sphere. But the father tended to be the one who introduced the child to the ways of the world. They say that mothers used to teach us how to receive love, whereas fathers teach us how to give it. Others say that no, it's the father's job really to teach us boundaries. That, look, other people exist in the world and your ego clashes with them, your needs and wants is going to clash with them. And so you need to set boundaries, and also that boundary works the other way. You are not going to be trespassed upon. Whereas the influence of mothers might not quite develop that. The father is the one to try and help you protect yourself. And that doesn't just mean physically, it also means emotionally. So you can imagine what will happen then if it turns out that in the family, the father either was not there or was some sort of weaker influence. He himself was maybe a pushover and unable to set boundaries. All sorts of havoc gets caused from that. Mothers tend to teach us how to yield and bond with others. It's a very healthy thing. But also, as much as we yield and blend, there's also a need to separate. These are two faculties of human existence. Right? There's being a part of something, but there's being a part of it as well, separate from it. But we'll get in more, maybe touch on this father-child connection a little bit later. One thing about the imagery, it's not indoors, it's outdoors. And that's very significant, because man in his true element, man's true element isn't really the city. It's not the urban environment, it's not the social sphere. It is, whether you like it or not, nature. That's simply proven by the testimony of history, isn't it? So the external world, they got that right in their designs here, because the mountainous topography and so on, that fits. Man is made for the external world, not the urban world. Shouldn't go any further unless we deal with a number. The fifth card in the series, but the one numbered 4, what an important number 4 is. That's the number of structure, fixity and strength. But anyone in the esoteric tradition knows that this is the physical plane. The world into which you're born, with all of its rules and regulations, with its strictures and with its own lessons to learn. The physical plane, the world of experience. Right? William Blake's world of experience, songs of experience and songs of innocence. There's, again, a duad there. Everything that exists has a foundation if it's going to stand. This is the card of foundations. And fundamentals. Everything's based on fundamental principles. Take the chemical chart, take matter and atoms and all of that. Take psychology, the consciousness that we use. All of this boils back to fundamentals. There's also this question of the laws in nature that can't be changed. The Umwelt, as it's called in some circles, as opposed to the Mitwelt, the inner world and the outer world. That Umwelt, how much can we change? It's arguable that we change very little. We adjust to the Umwelt, the external world, because there are literally things we cannot change. We grow old, we die, we can't change that, not fundamentally. We can throw a lot of money at it, but do we really change it? I haven't seen a person yet who's been able to avoid death. So with this archetype, when you see it working in your life, you're going to see very starkly that this is a card that represents your conformity. First of all, you have to master those laws, and that takes how many decades? So there's the tuition, there's the learning of the rules and regulations. Hopefully the parents assist in this journey of you learning what's what. If they don't, then hopefully the job is picked up by uncles and grandfathers or other surrogate parents. But even if they do a shoddy job, and even if they're even not present, you still have to learn how to conform. So there's going to be immediately a struggle with that polymorphous, perverse, fool-like part of us that could give a damn about that and wants to walk the crooked roads and run free and unrestricted. So the emperor is this, look how square the throne is, right? The whole concept of is, here are certain rules that I can't change, I have to go along with it. And if I do want to replace those rules, don't I have to dream up a better system? Otherwise I'm just a basic destroyer. We'll be unpacking that a little bit later. This conflict between conforming and then wanting to break the rules, but then how do we break the rules? Are we replacing it with something better, more consistent, evolving in other words, or do we just destroy for the sake of destruction? And we have to understand also that this fool, if you contrast this card with the fool, yeah, the fool is clearly without order. He's walking those crooked roads. And that might seem on the surface to be a very different relationship than the road that the emperor walks. But might not the fool in his journey for a period of time need to take on some of the traits of the emperor? And might not the emperor upon his journey also need to understand what it is to be a fool? Now we know that this is true if you read the myths of King Arthur. Even going back to Gilgamesh, there's the whole concept of the wild man of the forest in that. But even more in the West, you have King Arthur, who experiences, around about the time when the knights are setting off for the Grail, he has an underworld experience. He has a madness to deal with. The king himself, King Arthur, loses the thread. You know, we saw this in the Shakespeare's King Lear, very, very emphasized, of the fall of a mighty one, a man of great wisdom in one sense, but he literally becomes fool-like, and he's accompanied by a character who plays the fool literally. But just in short, the number 4 has so many interesting connotations. So if this card fell in a reading, you could tell a lot just by the number 4. That this is order, structure, rules you can't change, a certain period of adjustment, and so on. The planet ruler of the card also tells us a great deal. And that is Mars, the famous Mars. We have the Empress being Venus, and we have the planet Mars. And Mars is the ruler of Aries, but in mythology, Mars was the national god of the Romans. His counterpoint in the Greeks was Ares, A-R-E-S. Major festivals of this god were, I think, from mid-March, March 23rd, but some people say from February, mid-February into mid-March was the festivals of the deity Mars. And certainly, again, just to emphasize that the god Mars is enthusiasm, aspiration, energy, assertiveness, competitiveness, aggression and achievement, concept of progress and willpower and goal orientation, and I would say also self-reliance. That involves self-improvement. And also, this is a card, again, very much of the future tense when it comes to time, the temporal concept. And again, as we already said, it's the energy that one has to gain mastery over anything, let alone mastery over the world. In what I've just spoken about, when a child is born, don't you need a thing called energy to even hope to do? And what happens if you just are constitutionally, you don't have it? You think that's not going to matter? So your quota of energy is one of those fundamentals, and this is the card that represents that. Mars is the ruler of weapons and sharp objects, so he would be the deity of the martial arts, certainly of battles and war, and the whole sense of glory and victory, you know, march or die idea, the euphoria of conquest and overcoming obstacles in other senses. And as we'll see, he represents Aries, the first house of the zodiac. Often in charts, and I think you can do this either in Western astrology or you can do it in a miscellaneous kind of astrological system like my own taroscopic approach. A chart is made of a sun sign, and then you have this famous rising sign, which involves this first house of Aries, actually. And so I've often thought that the sun sign represents, in one sense, what it is we're meant to attain. Right? Just being born under that sign sort of doesn't mean that you have these traits like common or garden astrology. Oh, he's a Taurus, so he'll be like a Taurus, or he's a Virgo, they'll be like a Virgo. No, I don't think it's, I think that applies to a certain extent, but it's not just simply a metaphor for your characterological traits. On a deeper level, the sun sign might represent what it is that you're to achieve in this life. And the rising sign, I mean, again, this is all open to argument, but the rising sign might represent the energy, as we said. Aries is the energy, or the source of energy, the powerhouse, the sort of a power plant of your chart. So that gives you the raw fuel of how you're going to attain that goal. So these are the coordinates, the two axes, which very much helps people. We teach this in the mystery school, and it helps people get their teeth into astrology, of looking at it that way. So even as a beginner, even if you dig out your own chart and look at it yourself without anybody's help, just from that point of view, hey, I'm this star sign. Yeah, okay, I can see a lot of things in that I would make sense for me to attain. But how am I going to attain it? A car needs 4 wheels, right? A cart needs 2 wheels. So it's like, okay, one wheel is what I have to attain, and the other is how I'm going to attain it. And so Aries, Mars, the first houses of the zodiac, I think it's very helpful to think of it in that way. What you have to attain in this life and the means by which you're going to do it. A very healthy roadmap. You have a picture, a vision of the future, but you need a compass and a roadmap in order to get there. And that is what an astrological chart is partly all about.
what you've done.
A couple more comments about this western spring side of the zodiac, the House of Aries. It's the western hemisphere, western part of the chart. Oh, excuse me, it's the eastern part of the chart, actually. There you go. The western hemisphere is opposing it. So the eastern horizon is where the sun rises in the chart, as it does through the year, seasonally. The vernal equinox. Springtime, or the Passover, when the sun is moving out of the darkness of winter into the spring. An important time. It's the time of the Sol Invictus, the newborn sun, the newborn solar hero, when you're talking about these larger-than-life mythological characters. But when you really do your homework in these matters, especially from the astrotheological, sidereal point of view, you realize that we had an age of Aries. There's ages of each of the signs of the zodiac, and the age of Aries was where the roots of our present culture basically were put. So this previous age, even though the ages last about 2,000 years, and we're out of the age of Aries into the age of Pisces, but it was in the age of Aries that a lot of the various motifs that we find around us today in this age of Pisces, they found their roots there, especially in terms of religion and politics. As a matter of fact, for all those people who say that astrology is bogus and has no meaning, you see a study of precession in this particular way, of looking at these ages and what kind of meta themes occurred in these. I think is a great proof of astrology, actually, because a study of the age of Taurus into Aries and then into Pisces, once you really get into that concept, this is more of the astrotheology, you start to see starkly how many paradigms, as I said, of a socio-political nature have their roots in the age of Aries. Very important time. And if you look closely at the card itself, with these ram's heads and what have you, here's the little lamb you see at the foot of the seated figure. There's a lot of indications that the designers were very, very aware of that. But now that we've discovered, now that we're talking about this important colure on the eastern horizon, we have its opposition, its opposite on the western horizon. And that's Libra. And Libra is Venusian. So here we have Mars on the eastern side with Aries, and facing it we have the Libran sign or constellation, and it's ruled in astrology by the planet Venus. So we have again this interesting duad. And one could have an entire program lasting many hours on this relationship between Aryan archetypes and Libran, and the whole antithesis and even the confluence. This is an incredible story of how these two work together. But we'll not do that here. We'll wait till we get to card number 11 and try to deal with some of those. We won't do it here to any great degree. Only again to make that point that oppositions are a given. The ones that you find in the sacred arts, the Hermetic arts, are just there because that's innate to life. Those oppositions are inherent to consciousness, so of course you're going to find them in these mirrors of consciousness. The zodiac is nothing more, and the tarot encapsulates the dynamics of consciousness. But need we look through the histories and mythologies of the world? Right? Look to the early books of the Bible, and you've got the two female figures again of Lilith and Eve. Then you have the duad of Adam and Eve, but you've got Cain and Abel. You have Christ and Judas, Christ and Satan. Right? You've got King Arthur and his nemesis Mordred. You've got Merlin and his nemesis Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. You have in the Knights of the Round Table, you have Sir Balin and Sir Balan and their relationship. Certainly the more famous one of Sir Tristram, or Tristan, right, and King Mark, that great rivalry. You have Hamlet and Claudius in the Shakespeare. You have Robin Hood and the conflict, antagonism between the Sheriff of Nottingham and other characters. You've got Sherlock Holmes and his nemesis, Professor Moriarty. You have Professor Van Helsing and his nemesis, Count Dracula. You've got the Doctor versus the Master in the Doctor Who saga. You have Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. You have Captain Kirk and Callan Singh. And in movies like Highlander and even Dirty Harry, you have this idea of the predator that needs to be sought out, the hero and his nemesis. And where are all these duads coming from? What are they all about? The whole idea that until I've conquered or tracked down this nemesis, this enemy, something's out of balance. There's an external balance that's been broken or shattered. A great injustice has been done, especially if you watch films like the Outlaw Josie Wales, where some kind of normalcy has been completely devastated. This is a perennial theme in drama. And then there's an immense journey, uphill battle, to rectify this balance, to bring things back to normal. It's a perennial theme. The more enlightened you get, the more you evolve to realize, well, that conflict, as we said, all of these different syzygies and characters, the more enlightened you get, you realize it's not really about external divisions, even though those are a manifestation and certainly do exist. The more enlightened man realizes, this is all about internal divisions, isn't it? This is all about divisions within my consciousness. It's an internal schism that, between the ego and the self, between the id and the superego, between right brain and left brain, higher and lower selves. This is where the integration must take place. And the big question, and it certainly is a question we must ask because here we are delving into tarot, is how does that integration take place? What are the best tools and manners and ways and systems to facilitate that? Because if the system we're using is impure, how could we ever have a positive result? The enlightened man realizes, yes. We have to understand that as we progress, we are moving towards a more whole sense of being, moving towards a state of perfection. And as we do that, we not only become devoid of worries and cares in our personal life, right, the stresses of existence, but we might also even experience not only an internal wholeness and sense of completion, but also an external one as well. There are actually, if you really go into it, especially with this card, two kinds of what might be described as enlightenment. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but you can see this in the mystical tradition. You can certainly see it in any kind of religious tradition. Two major conceptions of what enlightenment entails. If you're coming from this school, the Martian school, then enlightenment is something that lies at the end of a journey, round the mountain or up at the top of the mountain. You've got to undertake this pilgrim's progress, and that involves advancement, experience and progress. And also, it goes without saying that the enlightenment then lies in our future. It's attained after immense hardship and a lot of hard work. But isn't there also a rival school that almost has the contrary theory of what constitutes enlightenment? Isn't there one that says, no, in order to arrive at this wholeness and this sense of completion, one must be devoid of all worldly aspirations and cares and worries. And one must awaken within them a sense of peace and stillness. Right? So the first mode, the emperor mode, they welcome change. They're using time. The second is attempting to transcend time, step out of it in some way, trying to negate the world and time. You really need to think about this because it's been right in front of us all along. We've never quite thought of how absolutely problematic this is, because one must be correct and the other wrong. And as a matter of fact, the latter type of person isn't a million miles away from some neurotic tendencies of world negation. I mean, docile minds are indifferent to external changes. You might even have some of these people in your own family or your friends. You know, they've just got about enough in the tank to deal with just the domestic minutiae, let alone whatever else is going on around them in the world or with other people. There's even certain people who haven't got enough in their tank emotionally, right? Their palate, their emotional constitution, their emotional repertoire is so anemic that they really can't even take on you. Because you're a person that has dreams, aspirations, desires, frustrations. Do you realize that there's people who can't be in relationship with you because they just have enough in their tank to deal with their own thing, whatever it may be, good or bad, and that's it. To try and work with another human being and to take on board all that comes with that is often beyond, you know, the capacity of certain people. Well, that's a neurotic type of nature, and it's not a million miles away from the kind of person who says, "Yo, well, see, I'm done with the world. I'm done with nature, I'm done with time, I'm done with interactions and human relationships and sexuality and, you know, all the rest of it. I'm not going to make a name for myself. I'm not going to go out and conquer anything or master anything, like we said with a magician, the idea of perfecting. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to abstract. I've learned from some guru that that's what it's all about. That's how you get enlightenment." So then we have to ask the question, does the Emperor's way at least include, I mean, he at least includes reality, doesn't he? He's including rather than excluding. His way, his concept of where enlightenment lies, seems a little bit more authentic, doesn't it? He seems more common sense. Right? And at the very least, he's working with reality. He's accepting life. He's accepting reality and its tribulations. In philosophy, he'd be called the phenomenologist. He's here with the stuff of the world. And by doing that, he's willing to learn about the stuff of the world because he knows that in learning about that, right, he's learning about himself. It's through the ebb and flow and the knocking against things and rubbing up against the world. If you lean against a wall and push it, you're feeling something about your own weight and musculature. However, the negator, the one who doesn't want to do any of that, either because it's so docile or again, they just simply don't have the reserves of energy to do that, in the end, might they not find themselves without a point of reference? If you're just going to sit there under a toadstool in a yoga pose, you know, with a shawl wrapped around you, or head over to the Ganges and wave some incense or whatever, or sit in front of a guru with about 10 million other people, isn't that a kind of a, aren't you going to lack a point of reference? Because you're moving further and further away from reality. And we're just questioning it. I'm not making any point of view here. But the latter part looks like a sort of a John the Baptist path, where you end up screaming in the wilderness. A sort of a Don Quixote path, in which you're charging at windmills in the end. So, two absolutely antithetical concepts about what it means to be enlightened. Find that very, very interesting. And it takes many, many years to individually work out. Don't let anyone tell you which is right and which is wrong. That's nonsense. You've got to work it out for yourself. And maybe, again, with that Libran opposition, with that Venusian, it's all about that there's a harmony between. It's not one way or the other, it's a little bit of both. So the Martian and the Libran. Incredible relationship there between this adamant attainment idea, you know, that can be described as this card does with the idea of ascent, right? Going up the mountain, hardening oneself, mastering the world, and the Libran way, which is far more subtle, far more quiet, far more reserved, and in a more exaggerated sense, might even be a turning away from any kind of activity or attainment in that hard sense. A far more mystical and arcane system, approach to gaining wisdom and insight. Both have their attractive character traits, principles, and some of them, if the traits are taken too far, you can have problems and chaos. Too much extreme on the Martian side leads to violence and aggression and all of that, and too much on the Libran side is far too quiescent, far too docile, far too alienated in the end. Let's take a bit of time and look at the Kabbalistic tie-in here. Being number 4, the Emperor can be positioned on Chesed, the 4th sphere or Sephiroth, number 4. And he's on the pillar of mercy. And one would almost want to question this hard Emperor, the one we think is also warlike and aggressive and extrovert and possibly even impulsive and self-assured, but the Kabbalah insists that that's the pillar of mercy. Interesting, interesting. But let's just stick to what we've been doing. If you have our 2-tree concept, since there's 22 cards, there's perfect legitimacy in doing that, then you find that the corresponding Sephiroth on the 2nd tree is the devil. The card ruled by Saturn, as we'll later see. So wow, is there a correspondence now between the Emperor card and the devil? He's numbered 4 and the devil is 15. But of course, in order to know, now I don't deal with paths on the Tree of Life in my system, but again, always keep an eye open for correspondences, as I said. In order to know what path of the tree any particular card relates to, you just add the number 11 to that number. So if you add 11 to number 4, you get 15. But the devil card is numbered 15. So there's maybe a hint at some sort of relationship. But we already know there's one because you just lay out the 2 trees and there you have this Saturn-Mars relationship. And we can immediately see that, there's correspondences all right, because as we said, any type of aspiration, any kind of movement in the world takes time, and Saturn rules time. There's karma involved, there's overcoming of obstacles, which is ruled by Saturn. There's an orderly way to do things as opposed to a chaotic way of doing things. And there's also that chronology, so time. So Mars, wherever Mars goes, there's going to be Saturnian traits that at some point are going to have to be negotiated, you see. Mars is the creator. He's the one who goes out to erect things and lay foundations and master things. Well, yes, but whatever is created, and you'll know this if your star sign happens to be Aries or Capricorn, that the Aries is very good at starting things, but don't things also need to be sustained over a period of time? That's more your Saturnian aspect. So they go together. Mars creates something, but Mars has to realize that you also have to sustain a thing, maintain it over a longer time. You don't just establish something and leave it. I mean, there's a whole other process, isn't there? You have to defend it. You have to protect it. So the Saturn comes in, just like we said, the Libran Venusian comes in to cool the ardors of the male. Well, so the Saturn comes in to cool in another way, and to make it, to direct it and canalize it. You might want to say that at this point, the Capricornian Saturnian energy of the devil card is Crowley's Hadith, this immovable fixed point. And that even in the life of a Martian, Aryan, conquestative energy, there's still, I mean, to hold a bow and arrow needs a certain kind of poise, doesn't it? The sword is useful and brilliant, but it still needs to be sheathed and even sharpened. In martial arts, there's a time to attack and there's also a time to defend. Now, of course, let's not forget that the devil, I mean, look, this card, the Saturn Capricornian, has some negative aspects as well. It's not just fixity, which is good. It also has intractability. It's the absolute refusal to change in any way, and we do see that in the Mars archetype. So this Kabbalistic thing is very accurate, because in the Mars we see that, those Capricornian, Saturnian traits of an absolute refusal to change regardless of what life is throwing at you. Where the Mars almost has to go to the complete extreme, right to the annihilation's point before it goes, well, I guess fire does burn you when you put your hand in it. 10,000 people have told you that and shown you the burns from their doing it, but you didn't believe it until you did it. There you go. We see this with the politicians, these crazy saber-rattling politicians at wartime, a complete refusal to morph, to change in any way what they've planned. But again, look, the positive side, Mars and that Saturnian, energy mixed together is that ability to have complete faith, complete self-faith which you often need in this life. The will, the power, and the manner, and the ability to resist all forms of obstacles and resistance that you might encounter. You're not going to do that as the Libran or the Piscean. You see, you're just not. So life demands that there is this Martian and also the Saturnian component. So there's a lot of interesting correspondences when you do that. Two-tree system. As we've been doing through the series, we should touch on Egypt. This is the card that, once you decode it correctly, when you have the true keys of decipherment, then it's quite obvious that this is the god Set, or Sutek, or Seth, which was a god that was so central. In fact, he even makes up the Osirian pantheon, where he's one of the 4 great gods of Egypt in that particular tradition. But even before that, even in much, much, much earlier traditions, going back very, very far, Set was an important deity. He was sort of one of the key sons of the great mother goddess Ta'ur. There's nothing evil about him in those days. That only came in later, when you had these more preposterous, monotheistic, dualistic concepts. But for many, many thousands of years, when the Egyptian priests knew what they were doing, you didn't have that stark, good versus evil nonsense. So he wasn't originally associated with evil. He might have become associated with evil because he happened to be the god of a group who became notorious within Egypt, i.e. the Hyksos, right? The shepherd kings. This was a particularly notorious group of people and their nobility. There's a lot of conflict. They caused a lot of conflict when they were in Egypt, and it's possible that their chief deity, had he been Set, Sutek, or whatever, later on, once this Hyksos was removed, their god, his complexion was changed. That doesn't mean he's evil, it just meant that people thought of the Hyksos and everything, all of their pantheon, all of their cosmology, everything about them, you see, was scandalized and looked down upon. So there's that to take in mind. There's indications, in fact, that Sutek, that Set might have even been a stag god. And that opens up a lot of doors, because that takes him into the Scythians, the Sarmatians, and into the Celtic, Gothic, Gaelic tradition. And it might even indicate, there's certain indications that he might not have been the stark male character at all. He might have been more androgynous. So there's that as well. Fascinating deity. I've written a great deal about Set and his worship in the Irish Origins series that I did of books. But just from a basic coffee table book on Egypt, Set is the god of the red desert, the parched land, the infertile. There's all sorts of psychological components there, but again, he'd be the side of the desert that is the harsher. We talked about John the Baptist, and we talked about these hard roads. Yeah, well, that's what Set ruled. In many images of Set, he's kneeling. Right? So you have gods with wings, you have gods who are standing, and then you've got kneeling gods. And the ones who are kneeling really represent earth karma, if you want to look at it that way, from an esoteric point of view. The ones who have the wings are more intellectual traits, perhaps. The ones who are standing represent the earth as is, or human traits. And the gods who are kneeling are of the earth and the animals, and a different kind of, we call it primitive, but a chthonic. The chthonic rules and regulations, right? So the scorpion, the red scorpion, the scorpion king, the animals and the plant life, and the ethos of the wild open places in the deserts. What's that all about? You see, so Set ruled that. And a very important idea. But again, some people have even pointed out that a god could be considered evil just simply because he was a god of the night. People down through the centuries have got less and less intelligent, not smarter. So the whole concept of having Set as being so-called evil just could have been that he didn't rule the day. He ruled the night desert, where you can see the stars. He's a stellar god. That's all you had to be called evil by the ones that came later on, okay? Other than that, I see a tie-in here to the Pharaoh himself, the king. What is this? This is the Pharaoh. This is the king of the land. So Straight up, it's the ruler of the land, the pharaoh. I would say that the next card, the Hierophant, is more the priests and the monks who serve the noble one, because the pharaoh was considered the great brother, the great house. Some people even think that pharaoh means that, the great one in the great house. And then around him he has his entourage of priests, which might be represented by card 5. But in a Freudian sense, again, it's the primal father, the root, the source from which all power flows, be that socially or right in the home. We talked earlier about the polarity in the zodiac between Libra, which is Venusian, and Aries on the eastern side of the zodiac, which is Martian. But in the Thoth deck, something fascinating happened. We said earlier that in the Thoth deck, the Emperor is actually facing away. He's facing to the left. And that might be significant. And it is because in the Thoth deck, actually, Lady Frida Harris, if you put the two cards together, the Empress and the Emperor, you see that they're gazing at one another. And I think this is one of the most brilliant touches in all of tarot studies. Just that fact, that Mars and Venus are looking at each other. So in one sense, that Libran Aryan polarity has been appropriated and introduced into the cards in an absolutely first-class manner. Because we did say, didn't we, that the Venusian has the power to quell some of the more violent aspects of the masculine. And so the evolved masculine doesn't just proceed blindly and madcaply in this aggressive, self-assertive way. He's willing to blend. He's learned something about what he needs to be a composed being. He's understood that he's but one part, one hemisphere, right? He's not all self-contained. He's in a world of opposites. His inner being is somewhat divided, and there is this work to be done, this holy work, which involves a bi-unity. So he's learned to blend. He learns to yield. Or, if you want, he's taught that. He didn't have it originally, but he's the female for him, the feminine for him, represents an education in that. Because it's not true to his nature, but he learns to do it. Just in the same way that the Venusian might learn something positive from the masculine, from the Martian. Each are confronted with the idea that you have to lose something in order to be a bigger and better person. Something must be lost, something must be jettisoned, something must be sacrificed. You have to let yourself go if you truly want to be embraced. You know, and hardness and intractability, as we said, is just going to lead to a deep sense of alienation and even a deep sense of failure. Look at all those old military guys and older folks in general, where they sit back looking at their lives and they went out there hunting and fishing and shooting and doing whatever they did in a very Martian way. You know, are they really fulfilled at the end of the day? A lot of them certainly were not, for all of their sense of euphoria at the time, that momentary euphoria that they had from a certain peak experience. You know, the band Rush, Neil Peart is the lyric writer for that band, is fascinated with this idea of the peak experience and what comes after it, what follows after that. What's that all about? Now, of course, on a negative level, the gaze, just like the polarity between Libra and Aries, well, the opposition here can also be confrontational. It could be an emphasis of our division, our struggle between the masculine and feminine polarities. In fact, I have a quote from Rainer Funk, the editor of the book by Leonard Schlein, Love, Sex and Matriarchy. And he says, "We will never understand the psychology of either women or men as long as we fail to acknowledge that a state of war has existed between the sexes for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years ago, patriarchy triumphed over women, and society became organized on the basis of male domination. Women became the property of men and were obliged to be grateful to them for every concession." So is that gaze of our emperor at this point one of those gazes, that happen where, hey, don't step out of line, I'm owning you, where the gaze becomes a means of denigrating and demoting? This brings up a whole Hegelian thing between the master and slave. Arno Gruen, psychologist, in his book The Insanity of Normalcy, he says that because the myth of maleness has an insidious tenacity that prevents men from being in touch with their inner self, psychopathology in men is far more frequently expressed by asocial behavior than in women. 8 times more men than women become violent when they are no longer able to deal with their problems. 4 times more men than women resort to alcohol abuse or drug dependency. So again, basically in a nutshell, they're insisting that there is a conflict. So before the male learns to yield, bring out from himself that yielding quality, that understanding quality, that ability to listen, and again, not have to go to Armageddon's gates to change even the simplest thing. Until that time comes, there's often a conflict. Now, talking about that, I've often pointed out in my work that there's another origin to all this psychic and social conflict, and that is an ancestral trauma that once happened historically thousands of years ago. And I've explained how the very consciousness that we had at that time was riven, fragmented, divided, due to the effects and the after effects of an age of catastrophe. We've gone into this very extensively, and it's not a subject that is really broached by a lot of other people. And we need to start getting our heads around it because it explains a great deal of what's going on in today's world. At that point, before the trauma took place, I've said that there was another kind of consciousness, which was much different than the one we have today. The kind of consciousness that comes about after the trauma, well, the ego, what we call the ego, is the center. It's the core drive at the center of the kind of consciousness we have now. It's what is left. You break a mirror or you break a electronic board, motherboard, into thousands of pieces, and some stuff is just flickering. That's consciousness. But the parts that are still flickering, and trying to bring themselves together again, that wreckage, the center of that, the most powerful part of it, we call the ego. It's the remnant. And it has the dubious job of trying to strike a balance between whatever's left of that ancestral consciousness and itself, or more succinctly, it has the dubious job of trying to find a balance again between the inner world where it inhabits and the external world that was such a source of threat to it and continues to be full of these threats. Various psychologists have divided consciousness into what is known as the naive stage, right, which is called the autos, the egoic stage, and then the third and final is the selfhood. So a tripartite system is often described. Eric Newman, I have a quote from him, he says, "The correlation of consciousness with masculinity culminates in the development of science, as an attempt by the masculine spirit to emancipate itself from the power of the unconscious." So he's emphasizing that even the move towards science and technology is part of what I've been describing. It's the ego's way of strengthening itself, getting a working knowledge of the way the world is, and trying to build back some of the original consciousness. Whether it's ever able to do that or not, it's hard to say. But Newman goes on to say, we call this path of technology and science, ascent, right? Like going up a hill, going up a mountain. Because we experience consciousness and the world of light as being above us and unconscious and darkness as below. Still under the spell of the primitive symbolism, which associates the upright posture of the human figure with the development of the head and the rest of the higher centers of consciousness. So we've got this higher, lower. We began the program by talking about these up. We've got another one now. Just the very fact of up and down, or inside and out. Once you know how to decipher all of this palaver, things become clear. Our consciousness is not whole, but once upon a time it was. Now it's not, so you find the hallmark, the fingerprint, the forensic evidence of disaster wherever you look. And that doesn't matter if you're looking outside the world, into the external way things are, or you're looking into the internal world. Julian Jaynes, who is an absolute expert on this subject, got an interesting quote from him. He says, "Was man compelled to act as a god? Was man compelled to act as a god after the breakdown of the bicameral mind? This is as his word for the kind of consciousness that we had before. James emphasizes how dark and foreboding this world seemed to be when it was a pre-subjective world. The kind of consciousness we have now is, we could call it subjective, right? But this bicameral period was terribly different. And we, after the loss of that pre-egoic state, man almost needed to reinvent himself. And that's where this aggression, this need to strengthen and to stiffen, remember even the Capricornian? You had to be guiding your own destiny. Because according to James, in the bicameral period, we took instruction from these godly voices within. So we sort of had instruction from this all-fatherly inner voice. I will put links below so that people unfamiliar with his work can get their minds around this. But basically he says that your own self-responsibility wasn't as strong as it became later, in which you just, like an infant, a newborn infant without any parents, now had to pick yourself up and go out there and handle reality, handle the world. In other words, there's that fool emperor, from a tarot point of view, state again. After the loss of the bicameral mind, after the age of catastrophe, man was the fool. His path was uncertain. He was going to crash over a cliff at any given moment. Everything about him was fragile and vulnerable and utterly naive and innocent. And as he evolved, another persona. He couldn't continue to walk without rhythm. He couldn't do that. He couldn't walk the crooked roads. When the godlike voices of instruction were taken away and there was this meltdown, like just chaos, everybody running around losing the thread, the new being that survived that was forced to become more muscular, more outer directed, and so on. We spoke in previous programs about this sense of errancy that undergirds a lot of what we do, and that our existence is kind of wobbly. And this is what Julian James's his work also gives us another explanation for. The way to cement, man's way of cementing himself wasn't just with conquest, but it was even through, he found stability in communication and language and writing, but certainly he did it by enhancing his sense of aggression, you see, towards other people and sadly towards the world in general, towards nature around him. His new complexion was a complexion of conquestativeness and aggression. If you look deeply into mythology, you'll notice that there's certain gods like Crom, who are bent over and old and ancient. And so that is also another indication of the old gods being hampered by an age of catastrophe, made impotent. The old crooked god, you see, who's winding his way in the dark. There's a mythology, Tiresias, having to go into the underworld, and certain heroic figures, again, like Moses or John the Baptist or even Jesus for that point, sort of been going through these periods where they're lost in the wilderness, where their great powers, like in the case of Samson, are not graspable. Their powers have been taken away from them, and they seem aimless. And they also seem to be on some sort of quest, seeking some bizarre relic of the past, right? That the whole motif. Well, that's why, because there was a past paradisical time. We've spoken in other programs about this Arctic homeland concept. And therefore there's this seeking of a talisman, or a seeking of a grail, or a seeking of some paradisical repose. Where's that all coming from? And we also have then, in most people of the world, even if they're not seeking those things, they're certainly seeking the strong father figure that will guide us, right? So you have this paradigm, and that is all, according to Julian James, a post-bicameral setup. That's the way we started to act after the age of catastrophe. That's my term. He doesn't necessarily believe in age of catastrophe, but he's speaking along similar lines about a change in consciousness. Now, in my view, this brings us very close to the work of William Blake, because his work also gives us an account for what happened to consciousness after what might be described as the fall. The sort of masculine archetypal figure in his work is called Urizen. It's a play on the word reason. And Urizen, who's again an old bearded gent, an old artifacts, going about with his hammer and tongs, trying to fix the creation and improve everything. The whole concept Blake is showing here is that, look, as far as Urizen is concerned, because we've inhabited a fallen world, well, we've got a job to do. So muck in and get on with the job. You've got to make this dark world a better place. And in one mode, you know, that's what the Puritans did. That's what a lot of people who conquer new lands go and do. So Blake is saying that his character, to talk about the great meta-mythologies of the world, that's what consciousness has done. The ego has set itself out. Urizen, the old artifacts, is now trying to hammer together a better world in this lightless wilderness. In other words, he's on a mission. And he's very Martian. He's very like our emperor here because he's impatient. He's zealous. On one level, he's got everyone's best intentions at heart. But he's not going to accept being stymied or contradicted. A massive undertaking needs to be made. Bridges need to be built. Get out of my way. He's out to conquer these bestial forces that brought ruin, you see, to the ages of the past. And the idea of the emperor is that through sheer will and gusto and brawn, you're going to create a new gleaming world, by sheer willpower, and you can stick a big bow on it, and everybody better like it. They better be there for the opening, and they better damn well like it. And you see this brought out in H.G. Wells' book, and also the movie Things to Come. Especially towards the end of that film, you'll see this emperor Martian attitude. Very, very well pictorialized.
There they go. That faint gleam of light. I feel that what we've done is monstrous. What they've done is magnificent. Will they come back? Yes, and go again and again, till the landing is made and the moon is conquered. This is only a beginning. But if they don't come back, my son and your daughter, what of that cabal? Then, presently, others will go. Oh, God, is there never to be any age of happiness? Is there never to be any rest? Rest enough for the individual man. Too much and too soon, and we call it death. But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. First this little planet and its winds and waves, and then all the laws of mind and matter that restrain him. Then the planets about him, and at last, out across immensity to the stars. And when he has conquered all the deeps of space and all the mysteries of time, still he will be beginning. But we're such little creatures. Poor humanity is so fragile, so weak. Little animals. Little animals. And if we're no more than animals, we must snatch each little scrap of happiness and live and suffer and pass, mattering no more than all the other animals do or have done. It is this or that. All the universe or nothingness. Which shall it be, husband? Which shall it be?
And of course, we do have to step back, in one sense, with a dose of admiration. We do, that idea to get up from the absolute pits of despair and rebuild one brick upon another brick until something new is created is, of course, massively admirable. What would our world be without its pioneers and its reformers, you see? But when you have, and you'll see this in your own life as well, when you have such a captivating project, it can sometimes become obsessive. You can become completely obsessed by it. And it's possible that in all the sound and fury, I mean, the original idea was very good, that got you going, and everybody approved of it. But in all the sound and the fury, and the original plan can easily be completely forgotten and gathering dust on the shelf, while a whole bunch of other tangents are gone into it, isn't it? It's very easy at some point for your own personal agenda to come first. This is what this messianic evangelistic concept's all about. Something great in theory gets you started, but then we find out a lot of petty things are getting in the way. God's taken a back seat. Unification is never achieved. For many people, that's what's exactly happened in today's world. They've got lost in just the everydayness, addicted to the external stimuli. And if they don't get that stimuli, there's almost a neurotic meltdown. There's one of those tangents. You want this, you want that, you want to create and just have the world turn you on every day, but then if you don't get it, there's a whole other syndrome starts up. Or even as you age, some people get very jaded. They've done it all. So now it becomes tepid. They're not being turned on by any stimuli. It's become vapid. That's a prostituted person. Well, then they're neurotically looking for some other high. We're living right now in a caffeinated world, buzzing with superficial people just absolutely absorbed in the domestic minutiae. And if something was to glitch that system, that's an inauthentic life. But then even if that gets glitched, now they're into the pharmaceuticals or the addictions of the drugs. They're inebriated or they are anesthetized. You can just take your pick. And doesn't this thing that we're talking about explain also the agenda of your common garden globalist? Isn't he a kind of Eurasian and an emperor? Doesn't he also feel that our world is imperfect and that charging about furiously to, again, impose a lot of rules and regulations? That's what it's all about. That's what we have to do. He's not noticing, as he's doing this, that the whole of society is going down the tubes in another way, that we have the panopticization of daily life. But no, they don't think that, because as far as they're concerned, order is being restored. They don't notice that, there's a kind of order that then negates all kinds of flexibility and mutability. They're not noticing that at this point. They're just caught up in the Lego set game. Another reason you get caught up in this is because you simply resent having too much freedom. And we want to live in these straitjackets. A couple of hundred years ago, medieval man didn't even enjoy the freedoms we have today. So perhaps the concept of having total freedom is actually threatening. Are we getting our minds off our minds? Is that what this is all about, with this preoccupation? The dark side of this emperor? I mean, how many relationships are based on love as opposed to strength? Are you with your partner because you love them or because they give you the needed strength? So that gaze that we saw between these two characters, is it a power dynamic? Is it about feeling better about oneself? And when we see this relationship in the lives of parents versus children, many parents just live through their child. It's what their child's going to achieve. They want the child to be a surrogate to achieve those things that the parent never was able to realize. You see that in these pageants that people are obsessed with. But again, on a more enlightened level, you realize that the Martian energy need not be outer-directed in the way that we've been describing. Martian energy, like all energy, can also be interjected. Control of the type, this morbid, malignant type of control, can also be inner-directed. And one of the ways that this happens is through body armoring, which restricts the flow, right? The flow of the chi within your own self. Those same rules, those same regulations, that same concrete can be there psychologically. And it can shut down the free flow of bioenergy even within your own being, which then down the line will lead to disease and certain even mental neurotic tendencies like phobias, paranoia, and even obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia and all of that cocktail. In fact, I would say, like Wilhelm Reich would certainly agree, that turning within of that anger and that energy, that control, is one interpretation of Freud's Thanatos complex, right? This sort of necrophilic energy that gets turned within oneself. It has parts that you might foolishly think are needed, like I said, the science, the technology, this hyper-rational, super-rational capacities that it has. But the thing is that this inflexibility, this typology has erased everything to do with innocence and childlikeness. You know, it uses wonderful words like science and reason and rationality, but what's really happening is that there's a morbidity there. All sense of fluidity and femininity and childlikeness has actually been abolished. And just like when we spoke about the Empress, we had to deal with some of the negative traits of the Venusian, and we even saw that with the lunar priestess. So there's a malignant masculinity, a kind of going to extremes, and we should deal with that because we find it in the world all around us. So spend a bit more time on that. Of course, this refers to the hardened, hyper-focused. This would be even where the Saturnian traits come in, but in a negative way. This sense of inflexibility. The whole concept of being intolerant about any kind of dissent. And as we said, being so destructive that you end up at the gates of oblivion before you even can tolerate the idea of change. In his book, The Voice of the Earth, Theodore Roszak has an important quote. He said that Freud traced the original psychotic trauma to the mythic father of us all, somewhere in the dim prehistoric past. In effect, the archetypal father figure invented the repression of the instincts, first by emasculating his sons, then by becoming the focus of the remorse they felt for venting their murderous rage upon him. So this is the conflict between the father and any other rivals. There's that masculine, malignant side again. Yes, you may choose to be this character, but then you end up with the Caesar complex, the Caesar syndrome. You can't trust anyone. You even have to have a fella taste your food and drink your wine before you do. You're a prisoner in your own palace. Erich Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says that man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biologically non-adaptive and non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and the danger to man's existence as a species. A couple of years back, in the times of our own fathers, they were worried about some nut pushing the button and then we'd all be up in a puff of atomic smoke. Today there's fears, there's just saber rattling and wars and diseases and all sorts of fears. So yes, this malignant side of people out of control, whether it's punks in the street, ruthless corporate types, embezzling and chiseling and with their extortion, causing all sorts of trouble, or some mad Dr. Strangelove scientists up to almost erasing the human, or you've got your Genghis Khan types on the loose. Fromm goes on to say the most ample and horrifying documentation for seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture, whose victims were men, women and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out time and time again. Add to that, the thing I keep trying to remind people of is the welter of self-sadism, which in itself gives rise then to a lot of passive-aggressive pastimes. You have all sorts of sports, not just for 6 months of the year, but for the whole year. The sports, some of them quite violent. Think of all the heavy wrestling that goes on, the boxing, and all of that. And in the crowd, you've got a bunch of 65-year-old women up there, watching and crying for blood. The whole bizarrity of it, the lunacy of it. Because, as I said, there's a dynamic of the projecting of this Martian traits and then the interjecting. And this is where I say this card is not so straightforward. We could have program after program about this because, yes, these pundits, these social critics have noticed something really odd here. Oppenheimer himself, father of the atomic bomb, says, "I have become death, the shatterer of worlds." See, it can happen to the individual. You can have it in the schoolroom. The whole Pink Floyd thing. Crazy, hand-picked, frustrated persons filled with antipathy for the child, for the innocence, for spontaneity. And so the lore aspect of this Martian is not just the aggression, but the open sadism, these obsessive compulsive tendencies, the endless need to be fighting with wars and battles, killings and destructiveness. The idea of control, that might is right, that I know what's right for everybody else, and I'm going to tell you what's right. We're going to tell you what you should be doing, whether you like it or not. Thinking that one is right in all cases, even if the evidence is showing you that you're not. These are all Martian traits. All down through history, right up to the modern times, somebody is telling somebody else what to do. Adler, we mentioned him earlier, Alfred Adler, the psychologist, he said, "It is easier to fight for one's principles than to live up to them." But this whole concept of the malignant Martian energy is seen so often when you have plagiarism, when ideas of people are stolen and used by coattail riders and bandwagon hoppers. The whole idea of rising at the cost of another person without due respect is a form of violence, a form of attack. competition. People are addicted to games, whether it's chess or video games, all the way up to your Grand Theft Autos. What's that all about? Is that from a true sense of superiority, which is the positive aspect of the emperor, or is it from a deep-set inferiority, which, as Adler said, then is compensated for by the inflation? And then, of course, as we hinted, for all this malignant aggression and all this acting out, the Mars has a weakness. He's not all-powerful. There is this Caesar concept of which you're lying down in your glorious golden bed, but there's a sweat on your brow because you don't know, you don't know when some servant is going to poison your porridge. The father, in Freud's tribal sense, he sits in his hut, peeping out, scared that his own sons are going to decapitate him. So this is the antithesis for all that strivings, for all that conquest, for all those heroic adventures and swashbuckling episodes. The Mars energy also has this feeling within it that all is not quite well. And again, it's just fighting fire with fire in order to preserve what one has got. So that adds a little bit on the pan that we spoke earlier of which is the road to enlightenment. Is it really the experiences, or as the great Sophocles and all the Shakespeares of the world have pondered, does that just lead to a sense of tragedy and lack of purpose, and maybe then this more ascetic withdrawal from the world of activity is the correct mode? As I said, don't let anyone tell you. You need to extrapolate it for yourself and work it out. But even if you come down to a more basic level, each of us want things. Each of us is after something or other. So how do you go about getting it? Everyone has a goal in mind. But then we're not alone in the world, are we? If I have my set of goals, you got yours. So in a world of millions of people, it's only going to be a matter of time before my desires and needs are clashing up again. It's not always going to be, oh yeah, you're going to help me and facilitate me, or I might not have the time to help and facilitate you. We spoke earlier, there's people who don't even have enough in their emotional palate to even know, they get freaked out. They're overloaded by just you and your desires. That's crimping their style. But just on a purely raw level, day-to-day level, one's own aspirations and desires can often clash. This is something that was noted by Nietzsche, this whole idea of the will to power. Well, you may have that will to power, but you're soon going to find that it's a gladiator situation in which you have to, tussle with the will of other people. Is that all life is then? Nietzsche himself said, "My idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies and ends by coming to an arrangement, that's a union, with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus they then conspire together for power." So what we try to do, realizing that there's enormous odds to overcome, is we get together with people of like mind to try and overcome those obstacles. Other thinkers have said that technology, I hinted at this earlier, but they think that technology and science is certainly a mode of aggression. We said also once before that until about the Neolithic age, man wasn't 100% sure that he was involved in the role of conception. And he looked to the woman to be sort of powerful. So we could speculate that the rise of technology and science is in some way man's way of rivaling the power of the female. I brought this out in my program, Divination and the Goddess Tradition. That is because women's status seems so mystical and all-powerful and markedly elevated that man then hankered after a means of rivaling that creative power. It's one theory that accounts for the rise of technology. Because that sense of female superiority, even though, as epochs changed, man became so more dominant, that feeling of her power lingered in his mind. It carried down through the centuries, you see. Even though it's arguable to say that women's power has suffered a declination in more recent times. And of course there's that concept that technology is justified because it's one of the means by which we make the world better. Or we think we do. What's really happening is that technology more and more is dividing us from nature. It's cutting us off from the natural world, you see. And that certainly is not a good thing. The writer Lawrence van der Post, in his book Young and the Story of Our Times, says that the history of civilization appears to be a sorry, one-sided history of domination by man. Almost invariably the basic cultural pattern has been the work of man. Whole areas of history are darkened by the ignorance of man of the truth that they can create only through the feminine in their own natures, just as they procreate in the world without the woman alone. Eric Newman, he goes on to say that the correlation of consciousness with masculinity culminates in the development of science as an attempt by the masculine spirit to emancipate itself from the powers of the unconscious. As we said, the desire to rival and outshine the female power may be the very reason for civilization. We spoke earlier about the connections that exist between the emperor and the fool. That in each of their lives, there may be a moment where they have to take on the traits of the other. But there's another way to look at this, another perspective. And this comes out of the work of a German philosopher in the 18th century, called Schelling. And according to Schelling, God himself, right? Here we're talking about the emperor, right? The godlike archetype. Before God could actually begin the creation and know himself as a creator, he had to sort of experience an underworld cycle of his own. According to Schelling, God dived into the abyss. And we're making this very brief for simplicity's sake. But God realized that he who has the ability to create all things can also destroy all things. So God had to understand that he has an unconscious as well, according to Schelling. There's a conscious desires, the eros aspect of God as the all-father and the good father and the creator of all things, for whatever that reason was to create all things. But that will certainly be progressive, and it will certainly be a very masculine thing. But there's also this dark side of God's nature. Now, Schelling wasn't the first to toy with this idea. He actually borrowed a lot of his ideas from the Hermetic scholars of previous ages, particularly Jacob Boehme. But before God then embarked upon his central work, he decided to say, I'm going to want to go and confront that side of me. And I want to do it thoroughly and completely. Because if I don't, it's going to hamper what I do. I need to know myself completely. What am I capable of? What is my dark side made of? How destructive can I be? So Schelling tells this magnificent story about how God plunges into his own abyss, into what's called the unground in philosophical language, in order to confront his own dark side. Knowing that he has the potential for destruction and evil, he goes to confront it, and even risks being overcome with madness, losing it. God himself realized that he had to do this. There's a little bit of correspondence to this in the cosmologies of the Maya in South America. But this immolation, this jumping into the fire, so to speak, it was imperative, you see, that God handle and know himself completely. Now, Carl Jung toyed with the same idea in a book that he wrote called Answer to Job. And to me that's not a surprise, since Jung basically, if you don't want to use the word stole, then you can just use the word borrowed a great deal of his own work from people like Nietzsche and from Schelling. But anyway, leaving that aside, Jung picks up this story of God's dark side in his book Answer to Job. We have links below for people who are not familiar with that. And of course, what do we notice right away? Could it not be then that this original, in theology, right, in ontotheology, this original moment in which God himself turned into the fool, turned into the wild man, left that realm of equipoise and order and light, and went into the abyss? Isn't that the prototype? Isn't that the antitype for every other culture's myth and ritual? Every hero in every culture undergoes some sort of underworld traversal. It's universal archetype. Well, Schelling is talking about the original, the one that really goes back. Man is simply replicating God himself. Because if God did it and could come out sane as the creator, or however he came out, we don't really know. Did he find a harmony between these two parts of himself? Did the dark side dominate? I mean, you can unpack this in many ways. Schelling was quite willing to accept the idea that maybe some of the dark things that we see, all those atheist materialists having that question about why did God create evil, or why is evil in the world if there's really a creator? Well, they should have read Schelling, because you'd have, if you're not the answer, you'd have an answer to that. Well, that's a perfect world, Michael. Shut up. Move on. So in readings, in spread readings, when the emperor falls, it indicates the level of activity. So it's energy. And it shows your investment of energy and the amount of work that might even be necessary in the project. Very, very important, because time is money and energy is money. So when this falls, it's about energy and the kind of levels of energy that you might be asked to invest. And sometimes that might be something you don't want to go for. Or hey, in another case you might go, no, I can handle that. Let's go for that. it's a Martian card, so it's always going to talk to you about, it's always going to reveal to you something about the obstacles. That's why readings are very important to get, because it talks about the challenges, the warnings, and the obstacles you might encounter. Sometimes those can be in an individual, so this could even represent an individual that you have to watch out for and be careful. Somebody who might want to override you, somebody who might steal your ideas, and so on. It might even, especially if it was in a reversed position, this might be the card to warn you very severely about not investing energy at this particular time. Or again, as I said, being careful about a certain person. If it's upside down, it might be telling you to be more subtle, hold back, don't be so impulsive. And in a more severe case, we looked at this with the Empress as well, in a very severe case, a reversed Emperor could definitely be life-threatening. Certainly could represent the onset of a disease or some even physical ailment or illness or disability. In fact, even a Martian card, when it's right way up, can signal danger for the very fact that it's Martian, right? I've seen it sometimes where when it's reversed, it shows that the person doesn't have the vitality, or that they're taking the easy way out. They just simply refuse to get up and go, and they don't have any interests or drive. This is a card that in its reverse position could fall in a chart of somebody like that, who's really kind of lazy, who wants other people to do things. They're not willing to invest the energy, but they're there telling you, you know, my life sucks, how am I going to make it better? And again, remember, it was a number 4. So when it's reversed, that could mean the lack of order, the lack of structure, the lack of practicality, that this person's a complete pushover, they have no chance of organizing their life, and somebody else will just come along and take all the credit. And of course, let's never forget about the theme of selfhood. The Emperor is a card of that level of autonomy, that selfhood, those boundaries we said. So not a good card if it falls reversed in those cases. Unless, of course, you can see from your client or the question that they're asking that in this case, this person has too many boundaries. They're far too resistant. They're very spooked by things, and they're a little bit too armored. In that case, the reverse card is telling you, whoa, whoa, you know, have some more trust, have some more trust. Don't worry about it. But again, if it's upright, then this is a card about, no, you're doing right, hold your ground, set those boundaries, believe in yourself, and if you have to go it alone, then go it alone. Don't you be worried about that. And also don't forget that anyone can think mentally of what they want to do, but actually doing it is completely different. So this is the card of action, not intellect. It's not another card that would say, oh, well, you're still in the conception stages. This is about going out and actually attaining it and doing it and learning from experience. Oh, I'd love to get out there and, you know, play my harp, play my keyboard, play my drums, you know, but I've never been on stage before and I'm really frightened by that. Well, how can you be frightened by it? You never tried it yet. Well, that's true, but what should I do? Try it. You might like it. This is the card to get out there and do it. It separates the sheep from the goats. And in a way, somebody could argue that for all the mental prowess that a man may have, you can easily be an armchair Sherlock Holmes. But unless you're actually out there grappling with life, what does it all amount to? And today we have a lot of people like that who just sit there, you know, gawking at their big screen TVs and kicking back in the garden, and real life is something that they really never encounter. We're living more and more in a packaged, organized, orderly, sanitized nightmare in which you're never actually out amongst the mud and muck of the world. And so we stop smelling nature, we stop smelling the world. And as I said in another work, even when we think we're doing that, we're either out there recreating, which is, again, not what I'm talking about. But on the theme of autonomy, you see, when this card falls, it's asking you to remember that there's a fight ahead. Martian cards in the deck, not just this one but other ones, often mean there's a fight ahead. You're going to have to now, prove your worth. You've said you're behind this project, you said you believe in what you're doing, do you really do it? Well, the first punk that comes along, telling you can't, you just roll over? Are you going to stand up for yourself? Are you going to feel your sense of authority and your power? Are you going to take the reins? Oh, well, our singer in our band's absolute shit. But not one of us has the guts to get up there and tell him, you're right. Well, what's that going to solve? Somebody is going to have to step up and say, you're crap, bye-bye. Right? So there's times in your life that you have to do that. And it might happen at work, where you're just going to go and tell that trumped up boss, what do you think of him? But can you do that? And if you can't, why not? Why are you so attached? Societies are now becoming so politically correct, you see, that in one way this archetype of standing up for yourself, looking a person in the eye and telling them exactly what you think in an honest and trustworthy way is almost a prisonable offence. Lo and behold, that you should stand up for your selfhood, the way things are going in our society. The whole concept of selfhood in a truly real sense might even become non-existent.